Welcome to anybody tuning in, streaming over LinkedIn. We'll be getting started in a minute.
We have attendees starting to show up on the webinar bridge too, Derek.
Disclaimers, good to see your name out there. Been a long time. We should catch up one of these days.
11:59. I'm attempting to reload the LinkedIn page and it's really laggy. That's probably my system. All right, click to join live. I'm not going to do that until I'm off. Well, let me know when you want to get rolling, guys. We've got a good head of steam growing here in the webinar bridge. And I think if you give it another 30 seconds on LinkedIn, you'll be in good shape there. I'm going to go radio silent and I'll be here for support. Break leg.
You'll make sure you get that record.
I'll start as soon as you tell me. Yep. Give me a 3, 2, 1 countdown to hit record.
Okay.
When you're ready.
My clock just changed to 12 Central, and anybody that knows me well knows I like to be on time. So I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. And then we're going to lock and load on this. Welcome, Gabriel and Guy and JT. It's good to have you here. I invite you to get into the chat or the Q&A panel. Pose your questions to us. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Eric, let's go live with this bad boy in the recording here in 3, 2, 1. Welcome, everybody. It's always good to look up and look out, as this young lady appears to be doing out at what could be almost any type of sort of external environment that she is in. Today's session, I'm really excited about, and it is situated around how to monitor the strategies and tactics of your competition. I will admit you're only going to see 2 faces on today's webinar, even though there were 3 sort of sold to you as the primary panelists of today's call. Zena Applebaum sends her regrets. She had a death in her immediate family a couple of days ago. Her father-in-law passed away, and that funeral is literally happening here right at the moment. So we're going to get Zena on another future session. She feels terrible about this. Of course, she shouldn't, given the circumstances of it. So Zena, if you're listening someday down the road, just know that we missed you. We'll get you on here another time. Danny LaFontaine, tuning in from Toronto, Canada. Danny, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
For having me, Derek.
I don't know that this picture captures Canada per se. It could be, I suppose, but I'm looking forward to looking out and looking at different tactics and strategies to monitor competition and those types of variables of them here today with you, and appreciate you making time, to take on my ask, if you will, of being one of my lead presenters today. I'm going to call you the play-by-play analyst as it relates to today. I might be more so the color guy. So when we think about what we want to achieve today, and I said this in my last webinar, everybody, if you tuned in about a month ago, you saw a topic around trade show and conference intelligence. And this series, if you will, is really dedicated toward people who are supporting in one way or another the product marketing, management, and innovation strategies of a given organization. And as I said last time, I don't care if you're in a product role or a supply chain role or a finance role or a sales and marketing role. At the end of the day, as our dear old dad used to say, nothing happens until somebody sells something to someone. And I think in this current climate we're in, that couldn't be more accurate. So in essence, we're all product people. And I think it would be hard to disagree with that stance, no matter what sub-discipline of business you might specifically be coming from. So what you're going to learn today, really, we're going to give you some tips and techniques of how to prioritize your competitive frame, if you will, is what we're going to talk about. I think we've got some interesting examples. At least I hope you find them interesting. We're going to move on to this identification process of how to connect with your internal stakeholders and, most importantly, set reasonable expectations of what they can expect to receive from a really thoughtful intelligence process in the organization itself. We're going to balance those realities of open source versus human intelligence. That's in our world, in our walk of life, we call it OSINT versus human. And then, just as importantly, give you some ideas for things you should be thinking about as it relates to the ethics and legalities and the compliance that are in as you seek to collect and analyze this competitive intelligence. So really, from the standpoint of why should you care, everybody's got a competitive environment. If you don't feel like you do, if your industry is attractive enough, you most certainly will at some point in time. Danny, what do you think when you see these learning objectives, kind of what the setup of today should be for our listeners? How do you view it?
Well, I see one really major theme, asking the good questions, understanding who wants to know the answer and why. It's critical before you pick sources or methods. It's easy to think, CI is about sources and methods only, but 80% of CI is preparing to gather the information rather than just collecting it.
I like that a lot, and I think it's an important one of the cornerstone takeaways of today's session. I don't know how often those on the call today pick up a vacuum, but we wanted to start with something kind of fun. And in my house, I actually have an opportunity to kind of check multiple boxes across this. What we're doing here is giving you a few industry examples. We think they're particularly fun ones, relevant ones. But if you're a company like Dyson, looking at that kind of high-end vacuum, and I've got one or two of these. I also have multiple dogs that shed. So Dyson is known to be one of those types of vacuums that can deal pretty well with dandruff and animal fur and all that kind of comes along with being a pet owner. But your competitive frame is going to be both kind of across three different pillars, if you will. That direct competition, you can go out and buy an Electrolux vacuum for $100 or $200, maybe even less these days. You're going to have some indirect competition that might be even lower, that kind of that low to mid-range vacuum, if you will. Ironically, I bought a Bissell carpet cleaner a couple weeks ago because our puppy was starting to have more and more accidents on the floor. So, why wait until the once a year I professionally get our carpets cleaned when I can do a little bit of that myself? And then you've got some of these disruptive concepts like the Roomba, and even the concept that there's plenty of people out there that may never want to pick up a vacuum. I can remember, my brother will remember back in the day, our mom had a beauty salon, and some of the shag carpeting in the 70s, 80s beauty salons out there, y'all. Not only was I vacuuming, I was actually raking that shag carpet after I vacuumed. So again, the takeaway is competitive frame fits multiple different categories. Danny, what do you think about this? Have you picked up a vacuum anytime recently?
Yes, but I am, my family at least, we all have our own rooms. I mean, they do such a good job of when we have almost having another person living in the house that does the one chore for you, big chore everyone really hates. I mean, they've only come to the point where we all name them. So I mean, mine's Steve. I have Steve the Roomba in my house who takes care of that chore, and don't even think about what my job doing the vacuum. He does it for us. So even keeping that out of mind, it's become such a disruptor in this case.
Mm-hmm. How do you feed Steve? What do you give Steve to keep Steve happy?
Well, the dirt and then a battery life.
Okay, nice. Let's keep this moving along. Next example. Danny, you're going to lead this one off.
Yeah, and I think it's important, when you're looking at any services or any products, you got to know what your frame is. Obviously, in this case, we're looking at IP specific law firm, and there are a bunch of boutiques popping up now. It's just become more commonplace. Obviously, you still have your generalists that become indirect competition. I mean, they still have, in this case, their own IP department, their own IP lawyers that they look at, but obviously they're not as directly focused in that space. So you might find there's actually not too many direct competitions. You have to figure out who you actually run your sales up against most often. And that actually chops some people off that direct list and they become somewhere in between direct and indirect. And while they're still a boutique, they're not as big of a direct competitor. And you might find that there's acceptable substitutes as well that fill in that direct space based on whatever product or service you're offering. The disruptors are interesting as well because you have to think about what the job to be done is. What are you trying to accomplish here? And in this case, we might be offering, yeah, we're a boutique law firm. We might not be able to do the tech, and there might be a barrier there to use some tech. But in our space, you're getting a trusted professional. Maybe you're getting the services that a tech might not offer. We might not be as efficient as they are because these questions are pumped out quickly. OpenAI can answer questions really fast, but you're hopefully pitching the services that you might be able to offer. It's a little different having a human as opposed to some tech. You think about what these competitors are monitoring and why. Stakeholders, who are you asking? What questions are they asking, and figure out what you're looking for. The why is always really important as well to think about. When you build out that what, always think about why you're doing thing or why you're bringing up a certain competitor. Derek, what are your thoughts on this example?
Running the firm that we do, albeit rather small in comparison to some of the attendees and the companies they work for on the line today, we have taken a little bit different approach. As a small business, we want to find one legal partner who is very capable of, in their different practice groups, spreading it out. So if we need somebody supporting immigration, supportive types of activities here for any staff members that might be non-citizens, but really valuable to our operation. That happens once in a while. Obviously, the IP strategy is important. We've got a few different trademarks that are protected, of course. But for us and the size of company that we're at, it's largely based upon relationship. Who do you vibe with? You pick a company that's got national reach if you needed it, international network when you need it. You hope you don't, but that IP angle is going to be different depending on really what your geographic sphere of capability is, and you're going to have to figure that out on your own. I think the OpenAI angle, and if Zena were here today, she was actually the one that inspired us to add OpenAI to that far right column, and it's going to be one of the more interesting ones to watch, right? As we move forward. The third and final example we give you today, and I actually had a few nights ago an opportunity to experience Uber Eats. I've done that before, but I've never been the one that actually ordered it. And so, being a non-techie, so to speak, I went through that process and I found it to be really delightful, actually. But I'll maybe share more on that. If you're Darden and you operate essentially a portfolio of restaurants, some of these restaurants like Capital Grille are designed to hit kind of the higher end, more premium type of restaurant experience. And then you've got some of the others in here that might be meant for kind of that mid-tier and other things. Depending on which part of your portfolio you're dealing with, your competitive frame is going to be different. You might be dealing and bumping up against an Applebee's. You might be bumping up against Chick-fil-A or Subway. And then you enter the disruptive kind of meal kit and delivery services type of competitor. And, again, when you think about where your organization fits, what your direct competition is, what your indirect competition is, and what those disruptive forces are going to be, if they're not coming at you yet, trust that they will. I don't know. I think that there's just a lot of ease and simplicity that can be provided to the way you orient your sources that lead you to the outcome of being able to create answers to key intelligence questions that are meaningful to your stakeholders. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. What do you see when you look at this particular example, Danny?
Well, if I'm going to order lobster, I'm not thinking about fast food. So you have to remember what are you trying to match up here? It would change how you collect on these companies, or even what you're looking for. I mean, you could even tell you present. If I'm looking at TGI Fridays, I'm thinking about different things than I would for McDonald's or even Uber Eats, right? So I might, for each scenario, each product, each service, have to tier my competitors. Think about certain competitors might be interesting for one product, but be lower tier for another. And keeping that in mind that you shouldn't stick to a specific model for each. You got to be a little more flexible and iterate as people change their product.
For sure. So when you think about all these, and then I know we're not going to read this slide to our attendees today, but we wanted to give some examples, of different types of key intelligence questions that people listening, tuning into this webinar could take away from this. What are your kind of big themes you want folks to pay attention to on this one?
Well, know what's important about each competitor. I mean, you see how it's broken up here. It's important to identify competition, but only if you act on these categories. Asking questions is the first step before you use which method to use. So don't just answer questions either. I mean, that one question here might be partially right, but you might just tweak it a little bit for what makes sense for you. And don't just stick to the same questions over time either. I mean, we know companies grow. Some of that might be a disruptor now, and you might need these set of questions. Be really quick to change, maybe in 2 years, to be a direct competitor just based on what they're doing, what you're doing, how everything's changing in the market. Make the questions make sense to you and be flexible with your key intelligence questions. I mean, that everything here, as the market changes, you can't stay stagnant. You got to keep moving and keep changing. Derek, anything to add to that?
No, I just think the parts in parentheses are after the area where it's focused. So external focus head to head with direct, substitution types of competitors with that interact, and then what's going to shift behavior when it comes down to some of that disruptive competition that's coming, and how are they going to do it? So your job tracking competitive strategies and tactics is of course made a little more complex and difficult when you add in those disruptors, because you may not know the types of questions to ask just yet. But if you set up your program in such a way where you know how to kind of tease out those best questions, and we're going to give you a slide here in a minute around how to engage those stakeholders who are going to care about those questions. That I think is where the kind of the magic really is done. You talk about the topics and the questions underneath them, but unless you have a stakeholder that cares about it, it's kind of irrelevant at the end of the day. And that's just kind of how I feel about it. When we think about, again, that question of who cares, if you're a product professional inside of a significant business, you're going to have people who are going to care about that product, making it to market, being successful in the marketplace, iterating on it and making it a better product over time, or seeing extensions to the original use case for that product, and being able to do some additional things with it, gain kind of extendable lifespan, if you will. And we give you a list. I'm not going to read this to you, but of course you're going to have people in finance as a product leader who are going to be intensely interested and committed to the success of that product. I mean, that, again, I said it in the last webinar. If you're a finance person and you're not highly committed to the success of a product, you're kind of missing an opportunity, I think. And I don't believe that that's really a vision of reality out there. I think all these different types of common stakeholders are thinking about these types of things. So forecasts, candidates for M&A, of course, sales and business development, thinking about how do we win more, especially in competitive head-to-head situations, whether it be direct, indirect, or substitutes. What's the market share, types of things. And so we wanted to give you as a listener here just sort of a rundown on some of the common types of focus areas that these various stakeholders are interested in. Danny, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I think everyone here, every attendee has experienced at some time. They've built a report or come with some really good information, delivered, and their stakeholder said great, and that was the extent of the information. So it's important when you're talking about who cares is to not deliver the nice to know and have it ignored. Understand what stakeholders are focused on and they need to know. Each one will look for something different. If you can find ways to compare and use other stakeholders to mold what you're looking for, that's great. But don't just deliver the nice to know information.
So how do we get our stakeholders to tell us what the difference is between nice to have and must have? Nice to know, must have. How do we tease that out?
Yeah, you can't just start collecting. I mean, that's a common mistake is to just jump in and start answering questions. You have to clarify what the request is. You need to do almost an interview with your stakeholders to figure out, what are you actually asking me here? And you'll see a list of good questions to ask your stakeholders here. It's important to note that 80% is actually figuring out the questions they want answered, and then the 20% is figuring out what the answers are or how to get those answers. It's remember, who always think about who am I delivering this to? Who are the stakeholders? How many stakeholders are you presenting this to? And this might shape your clarifying questions as you move through. And don't think that you can only ask these questions at the start. You have to keep asking these questions, keep modifying over time based on what you're finding. And then when you deliver at the end, there might be more questions anyways to keep building. Don't stop asking questions of your stakeholders. Derek, what do you think of the best question? I know you're interested in that.
I'll get to that in a second, but I think what you said, don't become complacent to a certain set of questions. This is sort of independent of whether or not you choose to set up a systematized, i.e. software-driven surveillance model around competitor strategies and tactics, or something that might be a little more human-inspired. Talk about that in a minute. But I've been doing this kind of a long time, and I've heard this question of what keeps you up at night framed as being the best question to ask your stakeholder. Well, lately, I've been trying to nuance that a little bit differently. And I asked the question this way. If you could have the answer to any one question or a few questions that are troubling you right now, that would inform better, stronger decision-making around particular areas of your business, what would those questions be? And what would you do with the answer once you got it? In other words, how are you going to make it meaningful? And I think that I found that when I have those conversations, it helps to move that stakeholder toward that goal. Okay, I could bring up a wish list of stuff, most of which might be nice to have, but by asking that question just slightly differently, I think it puts it into a more action-oriented type of frame. In other words, what's the answer to this one burning question that if I knew I could get it, I want to go out and get it, and then I'm going to do X, Y, and Z with it. And I think that's a far better way to frame it than what keeps you up at night. I'd be interested from our attendees, if you get into the chat or the Q&A, just kind of what your own experiences have been, with the way in which a question like that is framed. Moving along, we are going to look next at an example, Danny, of once you set up your sources, once you get to the point where you're surveilling strategies and tactics, this video game example using a strategy canvas, there's lots of different models that could be used here. I'm not a gamer, but it sounds like maybe you are. You've got some experience in this way. What would you say for the listeners who are tuning in, ways to think about creating something like what they see on the screen?
Yeah, and if for those who aren't familiar, obviously we see Nintendo, Sony, and Apple, very different approaches to how they do games. Nintendo more focused on their major franchises, those characters they've built out and they've lived with now for a long time. I mean, everyone knows Mario now, but they're really focused on honing on those games. They can branch out past that. Sony obviously has their brand name games, their brand name characters, but they also have a larger catalog, a little different focus. They're not as streamlined into their big games. Whereas Apple, as everyone's very familiar, there's tons and tons of games out there. Lots of developers who are developing quick games. I'm sure everyone here has played Candy Crush or knows of it at some point. It's not a particularly sophisticated game, but they are able to get you phone, keep you there, give you different ways to access the phone different apps. Maybe a few people will pay for money, obviously not the big group, but keeping you on your phone as much as possible. So different attempts at keeping people engaged with the product, and very different capabilities.
I think, it's maybe a sub technique of things like competitive simulations and wargaming and such, but once you can put your thumb on some of those silver bullets or true competitive differentiators that you're able to sell against, with your product. In other words, you got to find something that there's no overlap or sort of status quo type of situation going on. But once you put your thumb on that competitive differentiator that you are successful selling against, lean into that. Lean into those silver bullets that give you a true advantage in the eye of the customer. And this concept of building out your competitive frame, doing the breakdown of the OSINT versus human that we'll talk about here in a minute. And there's lots of different strategy canvases that one could use, whether it be something as simple as the strategy canvas, business model canvas, the playing to win, architecture, you name it, blue ocean. There is almost an endless number of good ones. You're going to have to find everyone that fits, the kind of the culture and the way in which your organization can use it. And I think that's really the takeaway here. When's the last time you did some gaming, Danny? You do it regularly?
Last week.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Looking next at these sources of intelligence, and we break it down really 4 ways. Why don't you get this started, and I'll support on the next slide.
Yeah, and you'll see 4 different categories here. Well, obviously you start your standard open source intelligence. That's your first step. You're looking at your news aggregation, your social media tracking, industry publications, kind of your low-hanging fruit as the easy to get, quick answers that you might be looking for. Your advanced open source intelligence requires a research that might not be as easily attained. So maybe your podcast transcripts where you need to do a little more digging. These social media accounts of specific competitor. It's still publicly available data, still not very difficult to find, but you may take some different approaches to get the information you're looking for. For internal human intelligence, you'd be asking the professionals within your organization. I'm sure we're all aware that there's a massive amount of information from coworkers that does not get shared. People have a lot of information in their minds that they either don't have a place to share or they're not willing to. Could be a cultural thing, could be a time thing. Well, there's certainly many reasons to that be that case, but there's knowledge that can help shape the remaining unanswered questions, and it's important to have them included in the conversation, in the question shaping, even in answering it as well. And then lastly, obviously, is your external human intelligence. It's when the answer isn't publicly available or found internally. That's the next step of figuring out who do I ask externally by finding a way to ethically attain the needed information from an industry professional or consultants or analysts, for example. Each one of these, there's a specific point to have them or use them. Standard is the bottom, standard open is the bottom, all the way up to external human intelligence. But it's important to know that each part of each category is important to use when you're answering questions. Derek.
Yeah, so let's get to some of those source types and key intel topics and questions that are commonly associated with these 4 different categories of sources. Danny, I think you're going to start in that bottom left corner again, kind of with that standard OSINT layer. Can you give an example or 2? I know we're not going to read our attendees this slide. There's a lot on here, but share an example or 2 and where you've seen success with it.
Yeah, and the industry publications and sites obviously has a lot of success. They're publicly available information. They can give you a good idea of what's going on if you're just starting a function, or even need to keep up to date with what other people are saying. Something to note too is you see through your eyes isn't always the right answer. Getting multiple different perspectives is important, and that's a great way to start. You can see market intelligence trends and things like that. Those type of questions might come from a publication, for example. For the advanced open source intelligence, obviously we talked about the social media accounts of specific employees. Some employees, depending on what industry they're in, what department they're in, might share a little more information, might give information that will help shape and it might change how you market or positioning, things like that. Marketing might be dropping their advertising a little faster, give you ideas of what's coming up next. So it's just keeping that in mind as you collect. There's obviously lots of great opportunities, but these are just a couple examples for your open source.
I like that a lot. And to your point, the earliest part of this webinar, you can avoid a lot of problems if you're thinking about these sources before you're thinking about what's the final outcome of what those sources can do for us, right? I think the same thing is true, and I don't really know why there's such a resistance to this internal human intel concept. I think it's getting better, but whether it's human psychology and people feel in less control of their future if they share, something that is disclosable and outside the boundaries of some type of NDA that they're signing after they leave the last employer and come to the next one. There's probably some elements and factors associated with it. But in that bottom right corner, if you're a leader in finance, as I used that example earlier, and I tend to associate myself as more of a finance-led leader than really coming at it from other walks of life. If you're a finance, director at a big company, you're probably going to find a lot of very useful information by networking and interacting with those product managers. So if you're tuning in as a product manager, befriending and building just enough positive friction. This is where that concept of friction that I've talked about before, I think, comes into play. You have opportunity to create some friction. Oh, go have a debate with a finance leader in your company over things like profit margins and other things that of course they would be finding very interesting, and it might turn into one of these topics and questions that your efforts can support around pricing assessments. Sometimes it's very difficult to get absolute pricing, but you can have a really thoughtful dialogue around discounting strategies, pricing strategies in general, directional types of intelligence in those regards, and what those pricing strategies and tactics might be. And then kind of moving up to that, opportunity to go external. I know this, we put this session together. Zena was going to jump in at this point and share some things around how external sources, those consultants, those analysts, might be very not only accessible, and some of this depends, right, on whether you're dealing with a publicly available competitor or a privately held competitor in that regard. There's different access points, of course, but if you can go external and get interacting with consultants and Wall Street analysts or other analysts that are covering those competitors, you can gain an awful lot of perspective, especially around financials and operational metrics. I've got a webinar coming up in, I think it's February actually, in the series around operational performance topics. Those are things that, as you can lay your hands on them, and keep in mind you're always seeking to do it ethically. As you can lay your hands on those types of things, you round out a competitive monitoring program around these strategies and tactics that's not only well balanced, the OSINT versus the human, but it gives you tremendous latitude to be able to take these topics that are pretty basic and easy to get, even very automatable, at the end of the day, with the AI engines and other things, all the way to what I would argue be the kind of the higher quality, more valuable types of topics that a proper internal and external human intelligence effort might bring you. Any kind of closing thoughts regarding that, Danny?
Yeah, just have one, and that's to note that you should be doing all the source decisions before you pick a software or technology. I mean, you don't want the technology to guide your intelligence. Instead, you want the other way around. Pick something that's going to work for what you need to find answered.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really key way to dismount that slide. So, I'm a huge believer in the ethics of doing competitive intelligence the right way, doing it the right thing, but also the right way. I'm not going to read these topics to you. This was actually borrowed from a session that Zena and I did about a year and a half ago with our friends Elise Nockels and Phil Britton from our industry. we came up with these 12 or so questions that are meant to provoke just internal dialogue, thought. Maybe you're building a competitive intelligence code of conduct. Maybe you're building, a more generalized research code of conduct. Whatever the case, you're going to have to confront some of the realities, of these ethics and legal issues. Things like, if I'm looking at collecting in geographies that are foreign to me, quite literally foreign or just foreign, albeit on domestic soil, there's resources out there for you that you're going to have to figure out how to tap into. I invite people to reach out to me. If you have questions about that, I'm always happy to have a conversation. But there's a lot of publicly available, really solid content from the competitive intelligence industry about these things. And how are you handling some of the more advanced scenarios? Is it legal in your company's culture and operation to go and do some sort of source recording and different things at trade shows? That was a topic from a month ago. Sometimes it is. It largely depends on where that trade show is located, what state it's in, what the recording laws of that particular state are, and then what are you going to do with that content afterwards? So these are just meant, everybody, to be some questions that can lead you to kind of taking your program to the next level. Danny, what do you think about when you see some of these questions on the screen?
Just one thought when I'm working with clients or anything like that is to keep your copyright considerations top of mind. Anytime you're accessing anything proprietary, just remember to stay within the bounds of whatever agreement you signed to, whether that's login information, available seats, things like that, sharing rights. Just keep that top of mind. You don't want to be making a silly mistake there and have it cost you. Copyright's always very interesting. So
I think it's really, really important thought. That really is the bulk of the content. We're not here to sell you anything. I said that in the last webinar. I'm going to keep saying it throughout this series. And a quick word when I say series, my brother wrote a white paper around the 12 application priorities of competitive intelligence about literally 2 decades ago, 2000, 2003, somewhere in there. May have even been a little bit earlier. What I'm aiming to do is kind of bring that back into focus. So this is the first topic of 12. We'll have this rounded out in this series. If you're registered for this one, you'll automatically be registered for all forthcoming monthly webinars. And you're going to see this slide basically repeat itself in every single one. I invite you to reach out to me. That's option 1. No strings attached, no cost. I'm here to help. Danny's here to help. I know that we like to think we're very giving of our time. There's ways for us to kind of go next level on that. We can help train you around some different ways in which to think about this. It often's not like we're talking about break the bank type of money, but it can give you kind of a starter package, if you will, around how to do this. And then of course there's always an option 3, where you could fully outsource this type of program to a agency like ours. And we're always happy to talk about that. But again, I'm not here to sell you anything. Really, the intent of today's webinar is to give you just some education, around how you might go about this. I'm going to get into some chat, some Q&A. I have not looked at this yet, so bear with me. We've got opportunity to get some questions going here. Danny, give me 1 second. Gabe, it's nice to see you again. For those that are wondering what Gabe's talking about, he calls me Mr. Malkovich. I do have my Hollywood doppelganger as John Malkovich, so thanks for reminding me of that, Gabe. We are going to buddy here with some questions, and they're difficult. So I see a LinkedIn user out there asking the good or right questions is critical, even more so at the time that AI is kicking in to help us and requires us to be competent prompt engineers. Danny, any response to that?
Yeah, I mean, the good or right question is critical always. I mean, that's part of the reason you have to hone in and figure out what the right question is. Stakeholders rarely ever going to give you the right question right off the bat. You got to always poke, fine tune and realize that the good or right question might change halfway through you finding the answer. So don't just stay honed in on the first initial questions.
Yeah, remain flexible. I think that's the key takeaway. Claudia, thanks for your statement here. I'm just going to read it aloud. In doing CI work, I've seen situations where there are emerging competitors that clients do not include in competitive research. They continue to focus only on the most common competitors. Yeah, we've seen that a lot, right? Clients need to always include at least one emerging competitor in competitive research, especially if they're winning deals against them. They're hearing about them from other clients. That's a pretty important situation. How would you address that statement, Annie? How would you go about doing that, especially from an OSINT point of view, to bring the emerging competitors into something like what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's some of the standard OSINT practices, is making sure you're up to date on what's coming on the news, who's in those spaces. You can find that information pretty well by just doing regular news tracking or even some social to see who people are talking about. And yeah, don't become complacent. That's really the answer there, is don't just let what worked once be the answer for the next 3 or 4 projects. You got to keep being flexible, like we said, and make sure that when these smaller disruptor type companies are moving in, that you treat them differently. You have to keep moving and changing.
Mm-hmm. Jim Miller, another Canadian. So there's a Canadian theme going on today. Jim, thanks for the reminder. Don't forget the non-market competitors such as government regulation, special interest groups. Always a great reminder there. How do we go about that, Danny? Kind of the same question, getting those special interest groups, they can be numerous. How do you finesse a taxonomy that includes special interest groups without allowing that point itself to kind of blow up your universe of who you're scanning? And how do you get that fine-tuned just enough where it's meaningful, but not too big?
Yeah, it's important that your data collection matches that. There's a relevance level that you need to keep in mind. Obviously, when it's your top tier competitors or the ones you know of, it's really easy to kind of fine tune and pick. But having maybe more of an open source, open search for maybe certain terms or certain competitors that you know of that are a little smaller, to make sure you're still keeping that monitoring up there, making sure you're still keeping them top of mind, but you aren't, like you said, not getting flooded with things that just aren't relevant. Just keeping fine tuning, and the one where we like is being iterative in how you search these things. You can't just stay on one thing, like we've said. Got to be flexible with that. And that will keep at least good in mind, is when these things start coming up more often, you'll see a little more traffic about a certain competitor, maybe disruptor of some kind, and then you can start changing how they fit into your competitor landscape.
Yep. Again, while you were talking there, I felt motivated to move back to one of those earliest examples we used, the competitive frame. I think this model simplifies it down to its kind of simplest use case without overcomplicating things to the point where it's unusable. So, I don't care if you're talking about the Roomba or hiring an external, like a Merry Maids, to come and do the vacuuming for you. The fact that you're thinking about it will lead you to some additional questions like what Sharon is talking about here. There's also unknown competitors operating on the fringe, moving into your competition space, that just that kind of awareness, situational awareness that there are newcomers coming in, and giving yourself a chance to think through that competitive frame of what's the most logical newcomer that might hit my space. That's the way I tend to think about it. Sharon, Danny, any reaction to that?
No, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So Graham asks the question, when monitoring, how and why do you differentiate direct, indirect, disruptor competitors? Why would I separate those out? You want to take that one, Danny?
Yeah, and it's important to differentiate. How you handle each competitor is different. Just based on how they match up whatever products or services you're offering. In certain cases, they directly compete in the sense that everything you offer, they offer, or they're very similar in what you're giving. Run up against them in your sales cycles. So you need to treat them that everything they push out becomes important to track and have an idea of. Your indirect obviously is still related. need to track them as in depth as maybe your direct would. You need to figure out exactly what you're matching up against them with. And then your disruptors are ones that you have to keep an eye on. They may not affect you so much now, but they're in the space so enough that you need to know what they're doing, and they might infringe on your base a little more and become even closer in the near future. But keeping an eye on the entire landscape is the intention there, and then picking and choosing what you need to exactly track, so that you pick the right answers to the questions moving forward is important.
Mhm. We got a LinkedIn user sort of maybe channeling some thoughts here, and says, I hear Danny saying Pareto optimality, the 80-20 rule, applies to doing stakeholder reference interviews. Do you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's making sure you're doing the work up front, making sure that the questions are correct before you even figure out how you want to find the answers. Putting the time in beforehand and making sure that you're not doing that nice to know that we mentioned. It's important. You need to know exactly what you're looking for when you go find the answers.
And I'll just take the opportunity to kind of layer on there. We talked about, asking the question of your stakeholders a little bit differently. So if you could have the answer to any one question or a few questions, and it would change the way in which you make those important decisions, what would it be and what would you do with it? I think that probably fits into this point as well, being kind of wary of having too long of a list of nice to haves and too short of the must haves to impact and influence, your internal stakeholders in that regard. I think Claudia makes another good point here. Need to be wary of going too far with information from AI. That tends to be the craze right now, for good or for bad. AI is informing. It's providing some obviously scale opportunities to intelligence work. But if we aren't aware that the AI may not be able to include certain emotions, hope or choice, or some of these other things, that a human would in delivering this back to our stakeholders, I think we're kind of missing an opportunity. I don't know if you have a reaction to that statement, Danny.
Yeah, it's important to remember that. I think I like also thinking about, everyone talks about how AI is learning. Who is AI learning from? What biases will come from that as well? If it's a specific to your company AI, maybe that's the way you're going. What exactly are they learning? And the intended biases as well. I mean, that there's going to be. So keeping that in mind when you use AI as well, there needs to be a human factor to the AI as you move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Another LinkedIn user asks, what will you do with the information? My favorite question. If they don't have an answer, that's a chance to explore whether it's worth examining or what they can do with it. Ryan writes, some of us still miss Sega Genesis. Yeah, did you ever play that game system, Danny?
Yep, I had one of those. Yep.
Yeah.
It was a good one.
Okay. Andrew out there, it says, there it is. Why do customers choose you over and above? And how do those criteria change in your performance against that criteria? I think it's just kind of affirms what we were talking about. Thank you, Andrew, for jumping in there. Sharon asked a good question here. How much work do you do monitoring patent submissions to gain insights? So if we go back to that slide where we were talking about different types of oats and categories, I think patents are somewhere on here, might be in the more advanced section. Danny, any opinion about monitoring patents, gaining insights from them?
Yeah, and it keeps a good idea of what might be coming out. It can give you, at least prepare you for responding in the future. If you keep at least a cursory idea of what type of patents are being submitted, what might be the next steps, or might give you an idea of the direction your competitors are going, and that might adjust you. Maybe you're go following the same direction and trying to match them, or maybe it's we're going to go and completely, change course completely and see if we can't find a new space that they're not in as well. So at least giving you an idea of what the landscape expanding might look like.
Mm-hmm. Sharon adds on, in what ways is technology making it easier to obtain intel, as well as complicating these processes? Is technology making it easier to cross ethical lines when collecting information from external human sources, for example? I'm happy to get that one started if you want, Danny. I think when it comes to crossing the line, Sharon, on collecting human external human sourced information. I think it's all in. I look at the intent of the person or persons or groups doing it. So if your intent is nefarious, then a good chance is you're crossing some type of ethical line, right? But if your intent is, well, I'm going into a publicly accessible environment, everybody knows that it is, I'm collecting PowerPoint decks and or going through open records types of evaluations of those available content artifacts. If you're going through it in that way, again, your intent is to do it in an above board manner. And then you got to look at the actors in which you employ. If you're partnered with, an agency, if you're looking at external or even having internal employees sharing some things that everybody knows they shouldn't be sharing, then you have an intent issue. And you're going to have to figure out the best way to address that. Usually it's probably going to include your general counsel or your HR team or possibly both. And you're going to have to really shine a light on, is that information really worth it? And Danny, I know you used to work for a law firm where you joined us. You live this every single day. The code of conduct of that law firm was probably on the more conservative side. I don't know if you have any opinion on this front for the listeners out there, but would love to hear it.
I see in Sharon's comment the unintentionally in brackets, and I think it's unintentional for so long. You have to be very careful, and even to be able to prove that it was unintentional becomes the whole other issue. Knowing to play safe when you're doing ethical lens is important. And just whenever you're connecting on any external human sources, for example, the idea behind what you're trying to collect. You don't want to misrepresent or do anything like that. So always playing it safe, making sure that you're not crossing those lines. It's going to just keep you in good standing, make sure you're not losing any trust internally or externally, and just making sure that everything you gather is actionable but not unethical.
Mm-hmm. Claudia shares an important I think takeaway here. Not sure if customers means clients of the company or its competitors. Both can be useful, but those of the competitor can be a really good source, sometimes better than even former employees of that competitor, because they may not be held to the same standard of exit NDAs and other things. I'm going to assume, Claudia, is kind of what you mean by that. Sharon continues, are companies you work with partnering with AI companies like Microsoft to develop their own GPT systems to access and use internal intelligence? Danny, anything you're hearing out there?
Yes, clients are. I mean, there are tons of companies who want to use the AI source to, alleviate some of the work or a way to make connections internally. It's obviously very, very careful about privacy and making sure that these AI tools are delivering on what you're looking for. But as absolutely, as AI becomes more sophisticated, it'll be obviously used a little more internally, and even find a way to make those connections without having to get specific interviews internally from your coworkers. But yes, AI is absolutely on the forefront for collection.
Mm-hmm. I actually had an interesting experience. I can't divulge all the details, but earlier in the week I was at a client site and I was looking at something that examined the question of what is an IRA. And I talked about this in our podcast yesterday, but if you point that at truly an open source like ChatGPT, Open Corpus, you're going to come back with whatever that application may think you meant. In this particular case, it was meant to be the Inflation Reduction Act. ChatGPT came back and called it the individual retirement account. So you're going to want to be really careful about the hallucinations that are possible with an AI. And I frankly think what you're driving at here, Sharon, where companies are using, all their data that might be housed in Microsoft Teams and, their own corpus of knowledge or knowledge management content that's feeding these systems. I think that frankly is going to create more useful examples of AI-driven intelligence than if you pointed at Google, and you're going to be beholden to somebody else's interpretation of what you really meant when you type IRN. And then, like I said on the podcast yesterday, it came up maybe it meant the Irish Republican Army. There's lots of different acronyms that fit there. Just kind of watching our time here. We got 6 minutes to go. PTW training. So, Gabe, I'm going to assume you mean price to win training. I don't know exactly what you mean by that, but message me offline and we can chat more about it. Where will we find the recording of this session? Michael, thank you for that question. As a registered attendee here, you'll get a copy of the recording, which will include a copy of these slides. If for some reason it doesn't come to you, I invite you to reach out to me. But that's the whole point of this, is to provide everybody with a chance to listen to it again. I think it's Ryan that says, follow up about the right question. I find that oftentimes your executives don't know what they don't know. We call that a stochasm around here, by the way, where the difference between what you think you know and what you don't actually know. You may also not know what they don't know. And that's probably the toughest thing to tackle. I would absolutely agree with you. I think that in the work that we do is always more difficult. And that's frankly one of the reasons why I've reframed that question. So if you have an elusive answer to a question that would cause you to change your behavior, change your action inside of your business, what would be, that question? What would you do with the answer? That to me sort of disarms the executive from saying what keeps you up at night. Nobody wants to admit what keeps them up at night, because then that's a admission that they may not know something. So that's where I've found, just in interactions I've had more recently, where it can be kind of a different way of getting at the same outcome. I like that. So we got some people sharing that original 20-plus-year-old CI application priorities white paper my brother Eric wrote. Thank you for that. Sharon, I think this is Claudia saying to Sharon, may depend on the company where your client or you are headed. For pharma, technology, medical device companies, I've found it's critical to ensure that new products are coming into the pipeline. They identify some possible future launches that can be uncovered. I think that pretty much gets us through the bulk of the questions. Do some companies consider the worth it question as simply the cost of doing business? What do you think, Danny? Any opinion there?
Probably. I mean, there's got to be some out there. But I mean, it's going to depend on it, who the worth it question, who's asking the question, what are they looking for? How much do you trust what they know and what the worth it question is? Yeah.
Right on. I'm going through this list real quick. With a couple minutes remaining, I'm going to take another question or two. Mark Chussell, one thing to discern product service characteristics such as functions and features. How can you find and quantify the soft stuff, such as it's attractive, or I can't put my finger on it, but I like it, or simply it's cool? How do you, Danny, when you're setting up some of these taxonomies and going out there and creating these monitoring programs, how you have any opinion on how you kind of discern, to Mark's question, the stuff that's cool, or kind of that soft level of insight versus the more quantifiable or documented types of feature function differentiators?
Yeah, I mean, whenever we're talking about, who we're tracking or the taxonomy, it's always important to know, a lot of people will come in with too much. They'll come in with way too many competitors or way too many things they want to track. And it's always about chopping down that list to figure out what we're actually caring about. You'll find as you start collect on everything, you're getting too much information and you can't find the connections, or you're struggling to turn that data into information and figure out what the knowledge is. So focus on what matters. Focus on these are the things that our stakeholders are worried about. These are the competitors that we've decided are our top tier, our direct competitors, or our indirect, or even the disruptors, and then changing how you track them.
Right on. So we threw a lot of content at you. Slides are going to be made available. There's obviously ways for you to interact with us. Free consultations are a thing here. You can tap into me anytime. I'm always happy to have a conversation about this stuff. I eat, sleep, and breathe this, and oftentimes do it, with like I said, no strings attached. Upcoming events that you should be aware of. We actually have a date and a topic for our January webinar, the second of the 12 application priorities around customer and vendor monitoring. If you didn't see the news, GM snuck in and acquired a Tesla supplier. That might be one of the examples that we dig into a little bit. Obviously a big problem for Tesla if you've got a supplier getting acquired by a competitor in the EV space. So watch for details coming soon around January 11th, same time, same channel, 12 Central, how to monitor customers, vendors, and suppliers. And actually, I'm really excited. Another of our colleagues, right, Danny, Emily Pillar, is going to be leading that one, kind of sitting in your seat. And we've got an external friend joining us, Mr. Rich Caldwell, largely from the A&D space, but he's so knowledgeable about just a wide range of different topics coming in there. So January 11th, I hope to see you again on this channel. Danny, I want to, from an American to a Canadian, I want to say how grateful I am, not just for you today, but for you every day. I consider it quite a gift that you work here, and that I can tap into your knowledge. And when I come knocking, hey, Danny, you want to come help me out on a webinar on the 14th of December? You say, sure thing, I'll be there. So, we covered a lot of ground. Just want to thank you for bringing your wisdom, and just appreciate everybody that tuned in today, whether it be, live or in the recording. If there's anything we can do or I can do for you, I hope you'll raise your hand and let me help you. With that, I wish you all a very Merry Christmas. Once again, Zena, you were missed when you listen to this recording. Wish you a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, and with regards to our next chance to interact, we'll look for that honor before January 11th, 2024. So with that, Danny, thank you. Any parting comment here for our audience?
Just want to thank everyone for the time today. Appreciate you joining us. And Derek, thanks for letting me partner up with you.
Yeah, for sure. We'll talk to you all soon. Thanks, everybody.